My husband's mistress planned to take him and my house, until I showed her something that left her shocked. The day I realized my marriage was already over, I was sitting in my car in the hospital employee lot, still wearing compression socks with tiny lemons printed on them. I had just come out of a meeting where a doctor spoke to me like I personally designed staffing shortages out of spite. And I was trying to remember how to breathe without counting seconds. My phone rang, and it was my best friend, Sarah. She said my name in a way that made my chest tighten before the words even came. "Are you at that restaurant off the highway?" she asked. I frowned at the steering wheel. "No, why?" There was a beat, heavy and careful. "I just saw Mark," she said, rushing the rest like she hoped speed would soften it. "I thought you were with him." My hands went numb. I laughed once, sharp and hollow, because that's what you do when your brain is trying to protect you from reality. "He told me he was still at the office," I said, like saying it out loud might make it true. I called him immediately. He answered too fast, like he'd been waiting for my name to light up his screen. "Hey babe," he said, upbeat, breathy. "Where are you?" I asked, forcing my voice into something normal. "At work," he replied without hesitation. "Late meeting. Everything's a mess. I'll be home late." He delivered it smoothly, like a practiced pitch. That should have been the moment it fully hit me, because Mark was a sales manager, and convincing people was literally his job. For 2 years of marriage, I'd been one of his easiest wins. "Okay," I said, because my mouth was still pretending my life made sense. After I hung up, I sat there staring at the dashboard until my vision blurred, like my body had quietly shut down non-essential systems. "My name is Emily. I'm in my early 30s, and I work as a nursing coordinator at a regional hospital in the US, which is a polite way of saying I spend my days triaging chaos with a clipboard. I build schedules, manage complaints, absorb stress from every direction, and tell myself it matters because it does. It also empties you in a way that settles deep in your bones." 2 years earlier, Mark and I had started our marriage in a rental that was fine in the bland, temporary way rentals always are. Then my grandmother died and left me her house. I remember standing in that kitchen holding the paperwork, thinking, this is mine, not ours, not someday. Mine. The house wasn't flashy, but it was solid, with a creaky hallway, a judgmental lawn, and a porch where my grandmother used to sit and watch the street like it was television. The house was valued at around $380,000, which sounds impressive until you remember what a normal house costs now. It also wasn't free. There was still a balance, plus taxes, insurance, repairs, a blessing with monthly reminders attached. Mark loved that house. At the time, I told myself it was because it was our home. Looking back, I can admit the truth without choking on it. He loved what it represented. Stability, status, a shortcut. I ignored the warning signs because I wanted a quiet life more than I wanted to be right. I wanted to believe in the version of adulthood where you go to work, come home, eat dinner, and fall asleep to something mindless. Instead, I found myself driving 40 minutes to a restaurant I didn't even like, rehearsing excuses for a reality I hadn't fully accepted yet. I didn't go inside right away. I sat in the car and told myself Sarah could be wrong. Maybe he was with a client. Maybe it was someone who looked like him. Maybe the universe wasn't about to kick my legs out from under me. Then I saw him through the window. He was leaning toward a woman with glossy hair and an easy laugh, her hand resting on his arm like it belonged there. He looked relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months, like his body knew this was exactly where it wanted to be. I recognized her instantly. She'd been orbiting my life since childhood, and I refused to give her a name in my own story. Our families had been close forever, the kind of closeness my mother treated like a permanent contract. Growing up, she was always there, always smiling too sweetly, always competing quietly. As kids, she copied everything, just slightly better. As adults, she got more subtle, asking questions that sounded supportive but felt invasive, compliments that landed like insults if you listened closely. Seeing her hand on my husband didn't shock me. It felt inevitable, like the last piece clicking into place. I didn't storm in or cause a scene. I couldn't move. My body went heavy. My thoughts slowed, like I'd been sedated. I lifted my phone and took a picture through the window. It wasn't dramatic. It was evidence, the kind you take because you already know people will ask if you're sure. Sitting there, I created a new email account, a secret one, like a teenager hiding a diary. I sent the photo to myself because suddenly I trusted nothing. Not my memory, not my phone, not my ability to stay calm. I drove home on autopilot. I showered without feeling clean and ate cereal because real food made me nauseous. When Mark called later and said he'd be working late, I said okay, like politeness was a reflex I couldn't turn off. He came home eventually, showered, climbed into bed, and breathed beside me like nothing had happened. I stared at the ceiling and counted his breaths because focusing on anything else felt dangerous. The next morning, I texted one of his coworkers I barely knew, keeping it casual because some pathetic part of me still hoped for an explanation. "Hey, random question," I wrote. "Was Mark in yesterday?" The reply came faster than I expected. "No," she said. "He called out sick." I stared at the screen until the words stopped feeling real, because he hadn't been sick. He'd been laughing, 40 minutes away, with the woman who'd always wanted what I had. The days after that confirmation blurred into something gray and unreal. Like my body kept showing up to life while my mind stayed stuck at that restaurant window. I went to work, handled a staffing emergency, smiled at families while my thoughts screamed, and came home to cook dinner with hands that felt detached from my arms. Mark talked about quotas and traffic, and I nodded like a cooperative wife, all while carrying proof of him wrapped around someone else. By Friday, the pressure cracked. I called Sarah, and my voice broke the moment she answered. "I saw them," I said. "I took a picture." She didn't gasp or dramatize it. "Okay," she said, calm and firm. "I'm coming over." She arrived with takeout, and that steady presence that only comes from someone who loves you enough to be practical when you can't be. We sat at my grandmother's kitchen table and went through our finances like we were preparing for a natural disaster. The evidence piled up fast. Dinner charges, more than one. Hotel reservations. A boutique charge that screamed gift. My face burned with a humiliation that felt physical. He used our card, I whispered. Sarah shook her head gently. Mostly your card, she corrected, because most of the money in our joint account came from my income. I made more than Mark, and I'd insisted on an emergency fund, because working in healthcare teaches you how fast life can turn. He'd always acted grateful for my planning. Now it looked like he'd simply enjoyed the access. There were cash withdrawals that didn't match anything in our budget. A subscription I didn't recognize. None of it was massive on its own, but together it formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. It felt like my marriage had been quietly siphoned for months while I was too tired to hear it. That weekend, I started treating my own life like documentation. I wrote down dates. What he said, what I later proved was false. I hated that it made me feel sneaky, like I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. Sarah told me I wasn't being deceptive. I was being sane. This is how you stop him from rewriting history, she said. On Monday, I went to the bank on my lunch break and opened an individual account. I transferred half the emergency savings. Half because it was defensible, and half because I was afraid moving more would alert him. It's strange how survival turns you into someone who plans in inches instead of miles, constantly asking how to protect yourself without triggering a war in your own kitchen. That night, Mark left his tablet on the couch. My heart started racing before I even touched it, like my body recognized danger before my brain did. It was still logged in. The messages were right there, barely hidden. He complained about me like I was an inconvenience, called me uptight, said I was married to my job. He told her he missed feeling wanted. Then I saw the sentence that made my hands go numb. He wrote that they just had to get the house sorted before he made anything official. Sorted. Like my grandmother's home was a loose end on a checklist. I took screenshots until my finger cramped, sent them to my secret email, sent them to Sarah. I felt desperate and ridiculous and also terrifyingly focused. Like my mind had finally picked a direction and locked onto it. When I heard the front door open, panic hit hard and fast. I shoved the tablet under a pillow, climbed into bed, and pulled the blanket up like I was hiding from a storm. Mark stood in the doorway longer than necessary. You okay? He asked. Bad headache. I lied. He hummed, like he was storing that information away, and went to the kitchen. I waited until his footsteps faded, then rushed to the bathroom and threw up quietly, forehead against the tub, shaking, sitting there on the tile. I thought about how my marriage had turned me into someone who tried not to be heard in her own house. A few days later, I made a small mistake at work, the kind that normally wouldn't matter. I double-booked 2 nurses for 1 unit and left another short for half an hour. It was fixed quickly. No one was harmed, but my boss pulled me aside and asked if I was okay. I wanted to tell her my life was imploding in private, but instead I smiled and said I was tired. On the drive home, another realization settled in, heavy and unpleasant. I didn't want to confront Mark in my house. I didn't want to give him the chance to deny everything and watch me doubt myself. I needed proof that didn't depend on my ability to stay composed, so I kept collecting. I kept acting normal, and the acting was its own cruelty. Because every ordinary moment carried an extra layer of calculation. A week later, my parents' anniversary party showed me just how bold Mark and the woman had become. My parents loved hosting big backyard gatherings, the kind that look perfect from the outside. The woman and her parents were invited, of course. Sarah came with me, not because she enjoys parties, but because she wasn't letting me walk into that alone. Mark arrived later and drifted toward the woman almost immediately. Subtle but unmistakable if you knew what to look for. Their bodies angled toward each other. Their eyes held just a beat too long. Most people wouldn't have noticed. I did, because when you're married, you recognize attention. At one point, they stood near the patio door, too close, and she laughed and touched his arm. I snapped a photo with my phone held low, pretending to check a message. My hands were steady. I felt cold, precise. During dinner, she made a comment about some women not knowing when to let go, and smiled directly at me like she was being helpful. My mother laughed, oblivious. Mark stared at his plate. I smiled back and said I admired loyalty. People who meant what they promised. His mother was there too, watching appearances like they were oxygen. Her eyes flicked to Mark for a split second, and in that flicker I saw doubt, not certainty. That night, I cried in my car, in the driveway because I couldn't do it inside. I didn't want him hearing my tears. Sarah held my hand until I stopped shaking. Okay, she said softly. Now we move. Later that night, I went through more messages, scrolling back further than I had before. That's when sadness sharpened into something else entirely. Mark wasn't just planning to leave. He was planning to take the house. He wrote about getting his name on the title and selling it to start fresh. He referred to it like it was just property, not the place where I'd sat with my grandmother and promised I'd build a life. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned, then set the tablet down and sat in the dark listening to him breathe in the bedroom, thinking about how politely I was coexisting with someone trying to steal from me. The next morning, I called in sick. Something I almost never did. Sarah came over, and I showed her everything. She called Mark arrogant, and I felt a strange relief because arrogance is predictable. That afternoon, I told Mark I had a dentist appointment and went to see a divorce lawyer instead. The office was beige and smelled like stale coffee, and I felt like I was confessing something illegal. The lawyer reviewed the screenshots without drama and asked about the house. I told her it was inherited, kept separate, in my name. She explained calmly that an inheritance kept separate usually stays that way, as long as ownership isn't blurred. Don't add his name. Don't refinance together. Don't sign anything without review. She suggested a postnuptial agreement confirming the house was my separate property. Something clear and simple. The idea felt clinical and ugly. But then I remembered his message about selling my grandmother's home, and my resolve hardened. If he signed it thinking it helped him, His ego might do the rest. I left the office feeling heavy but focused, like my anger and grief had finally aligned. On the drive home, I practiced my neutral face in the mirror, hating that I had to rehearse normalcy in my own life. After that meeting, my life split cleanly into two versions of myself. At work, I was still the coordinator who solved problems with a clipboard and a calm voice. The person people leaned on when systems broke. At home, I became an actress inside my own marriage. I smiled when I wanted to flinch, nodded when I wanted to scream, and documented everything like my life had turned into a legal case file. I moved small amounts of money into my personal account and kept records the way I charted patient care. Methodical and unemotional on the surface. Mark, meanwhile, started bringing up the house more often, always framed as practicality. One night while we brushed our teeth, he said it would be easier if his name was on the title, just in case something happened to me. The casual way he said it made my stomach twist. I repeated his words back slowly, foam at the corner of my mouth, and had to swallow down a laugh that wanted to crawl out of my throat. When I didn't immediately agree, he pivoted to charm. Flowers appeared, compliments, back rubs that used to feel affectionate and now felt like checks for compliance. He offered to cook dinner, something he rarely did, and hovered close when I moved around the kitchen. One evening, he poured me a glass of wine and sighed about how disconnected we'd been. He said it like he was wounded, like he was the one lacking something. Then he slid in his favorite weapon, suggesting I cared more about my job than about us. I finally snapped enough to tell him what my job actually was. How it involved watching people suffer and absorbing stress that didn't belong to me. He backed off just long enough to regroup, then casually suggested refinancing the house, using equity for upgrades and a vacation. When I gripped my glass too tightly, it slipped and shattered, cutting my finger. He wrapped my hand in a towel, concern flashing briefly across his face, then immediately told me not to mention it to my mother. That sentence landed harder than the cut, the quiet attempt to control who I spoke to. A few days later, I told him I'd spoken to someone at the bank and they needed paperwork regarding the title, casually adding that my mother insisted on documentation. I knew he hated her involvement and would rather sign something than listen to her opinions. He rolled his eyes and agreed to just go sign. The day we walked into the lawyer's office, my heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. Mark joked with the receptionist, flipped through the document like he owned the place, then paused at certain phrases. When he asked what they meant, the lawyer explained calmly that the agreement confirmed the house was my separate property, and that he would be waiving any claim. She made it very clear she didn't represent him, encouraged him to seek his own counsel, and repeated that signing meant he understood and agreed voluntarily. He hesitated, pride and suspicion flickering across his face. I leaned in and told him softly that if he didn't trust me, we could drop the whole thing. The idea of looking weak in front of my mother tipped him over. He straightened, signed, and the sound of the pen scratching across paper felt final. In the car. Afterward, he was unusually quiet. I asked if he was okay, and he shrugged it off as paperwork fatigue. I stared at the road, adrenaline roaring in my ears, because if I looked at him I might start shaking. That night, alone in the bathroom, I stared at myself in the mirror and whispered okay, like I was grounding myself in reality. Betrayal has a way of isolating you, making you question your instincts even when you're staring at proof. To fight that, I decided to pull the truth into the open on my terms. I planned a Sunday lunch at my parents' house and invited both families, including the woman's parents. I framed it as an important announcement. Mark was visibly excited, clearly assuming it had something to do with the house. Sarah came early with a device to mirror her phone to the television, and we tested it twice because I trusted nothing to behave when it mattered. When everyone arrived, the atmosphere was painfully normal. Smiles, small talk, compliments about food. The woman showed up in a bright dress and acted like she belonged. My mother hugged her warmly, and I felt my skin crawl. Mark kept touching my knee under the table like he was performing for an audience. After lunch, I stood up and cleared my throat, my voice sounding too loud in the living room. Before I could finish my first sentence, Mark laughed and made a joke about my lifelong obsession with the woman, dismissing me like I was being dramatic. My mother-in-law snapped that I should be embarrassed, already defending her son. For a moment, I wanted to disappear. Instead, Sarah stood up beside me and mirrored the first screenshot onto the television. The room went silent as messages filled the screen, one after another. Mark calling me an obstacle, talking about getting on the title, mentioning selling the house for a new beginning. My mother covered her mouth, tears welling without sound. My father stood slowly, face drained of color. My mother-in-law's expression collapsed into shock. The woman froze, her practiced smile shattering. Mark looked from the screen to me and back again, panic overtaking charm. He demanded to know what it was, his voice cracking. I told him calmly that before he started talking about the house, he should remember he'd signed paperwork waiving any claim to it. The color drained from his face. He accused me of tricking him, loud enough to make my mother flinch. I told him I protected myself from him. The woman tried to laugh it off, claiming he'd just been venting, stressed. My father pointed to the door without raising his voice. That was enough. Her parents left first, humiliation heavy in their posture. Mark's parents followed, furious and embarrassed, my mother-in-law unable to find a way to blame me convincingly. Mark lingered, like he still thought he could smooth this over. When he reached for my arm, I stepped back. I'm done, I said, surprising myself with how steady it sounded. For the first time, he had no script. After everyone left, my mother broke down, and my father hugged me hard, apologizing like my life had been contaminated. I drove home alone and sat in my driveway shaking, not triumphant, just hollow. The next day, I followed my lawyer's advice and acted quickly. I filed what needed filing and changed the locks. The house was my separate property, and Mark had left after the confrontation, so I secured my home and documented everything. Sarah came over with coffee and a toolkit, helping me inventory every room like I was narrating a documentary of my own life. I filmed drawers, closets, appliances, because the idea of him later claiming I hid something made my stomach churn. My mother stayed a few nights, hovering and folding laundry, and I didn't have the energy to argue. Mark's messages swung wildly between apologies and accusations, telling me I humiliated him and should have handled it privately. I replied once, pointing out he'd handled cheating privately and asking how that went. When he asked to collect his things, my lawyer warned me not to be alone. We scheduled a daytime pickup with my father and Sarah present. I packed his belongings into boxes, labeling them with a petty satisfaction I didn't bother hiding, and stacked them in the garage so he wouldn't step through the house. When he arrived, he looked wrecked, red-eyed, and desperate, immediately accusing me of throwing him out. My father told him to get his boxers. He tried to plead with me, asked if I was really doing this. I said yes, and meant it. He warned I'd regret it, slammed his trunk, and drove away. After he left, I sat on the garage step, shaking until my father told me he was proud of me. And for the first time since the restaurant, I cried in a way that felt like release. The morning after Mark took his boxers, I walked into my first therapy appointment feeling like my body was running ahead of my mind. I thought I'd be composed, but when the receptionist smiled kindly, something in me cracked and I started crying before I even sat down. It embarrassed me, but my therapist treated it like a normal response, not a failure. She said betrayal is an injury, not a personality flaw, and that my nervous system was acting like it was still bracing for impact because, for a long time, it had been. Hearing my chaos described in calm, clinical language helped more than I expected. When she asked what I did during panic, I admitted I checked locks repeatedly, reread messages, clung to screenshots like reality might dissolve if I didn't keep proving it. She told me that wasn't weakness, it was my brain searching for certainty. We worked on small anchors, things that felt almost silly at first, naming objects in the room when my chest tightened, breathing patterns that felt fake until they didn't. Rules about not rereading messages after a certain hour because it kept my adrenaline high. Plans for when my thoughts dragged me back to that restaurant window. Stand up, put my feet on the floor, say the date, the location, and remind myself Mark wasn't in my house anymore. It didn't fix everything, but it gave me tools that felt sturdier than willpower. Work, meanwhile, got harder before it got easier. I thought the hospital would distract me, but sometimes it just mirrored my internal chaos. I snapped at a nurse one day for being late, saw her eyes widen, and immediately felt sick with guilt. I apologized later, and she accepted. But the shame lingered. My boss pulled me aside again and told me I didn't need to explain, but I needed to take care of myself before burnout swallowed me whole. I took a few days of leave, not because it solved anything, but because my body needed a pause from constant alert. During those days, my mother hovered, folding towels and trying to smooth everything with politeness. She mentioned that the woman's parents had called, mortified, wanting to talk. I stared at the towels and said I wasn't interested. My father backed me up immediately, saying I didn't know comfort to people who'd treated me like collateral damage. Watching my parents disagree so openly was jarring, but it also clarified something painful. Betrayal doesn't just fracture a marriage, it exposes weak spots in your entire ecosystem. I chose not to engage, even when my mother accused me of being cruel. For the first time, I let honesty be louder than peacekeeping. The divorce process moved slowly, grinding forward with paperwork and deadlines that shifted without warning. Mark tried every tactic he had. When charm didn't work, he leaned into humiliation, telling mutual acquaintances I was cold and calculating, painting himself as a man blindsided by a heartless wife. Part of me wanted to correct every lie, but my therapist reminded me I didn't have to attend every argument I was invited to. So I focused on what I could control: my accounts, my boundaries, my sleep, the small rituals that made my house feel like mine again. Mediation arrived like an appointment you dread but can't cancel. Sitting across from Mark in a sterile office felt surreal, like I was staring at a stranger wearing my husband's face. He opened with disbelief, asking if I was really going through with this. When he demanded half of everything, including the house, my lawyer calmly reminded everyone that the house was separate, property by inheritance and backed by a signed postnuptial agreement. Watching Mark's confidence collapse in real time was unsettling, not satisfying. He accused me of setting him up, his anger sharp and desperate. I named it for what it was, telling him he was angry he couldn't take what wasn't his. The rest of mediation was tedious and hostile, dividing assets and debt, closing accounts, preventing him from draining money in the meantime. When it ended, I didn't feel victorious. I felt drained. The bank visits that followed were fluorescent and unremarkable, but crucial. I froze transfers, closed joint accounts properly, and made sure my paycheck was no longer a shared vulnerability. Mark oscillated between apologies and accusations, claiming I stole from him, ignoring the overtime and missed holidays that built most of that savings. One night, I drafted a long explanation text, then deleted it. I didn't owe him a persuasive essay. Around that time, one of his coworkers reached out, admitting Mark had asked her to cover for him and offering to put it in writing. She did, and I attached it to my records like another piece of armor. At home, the quiet wasn't immediately peaceful. Every creak made my heart jump. I had nightmares where the restaurant window replayed on a loop. Sometimes my phone buzzing sent me spiraling. I hated how reactive my body had become. One night, I impulsively posted something vague online about betrayal, then deleted it within minutes, ashamed of turning pain into content. My therapist asked what I missed most, and the answer surprised me with its simplicity. I missed thinking I was safe, so I rebuilt safety in practical ways. I repainted the bedroom because the old walls held too many memories. I donated items Mark claimed were his. I threw out his cologne. I rearranged furniture like movement might dislodge grief. I created routines around locking doors and going to bed, rules that retrained my body to stand down. A month later, Mark tried to contest the agreement, claiming he didn't understand what he'd signed. The hearing was short and clinical. My lawyer walked the judge through the documentation, the advisories, the notary, the messages proving intent. The judge declined to entertain regret as a legal strategy. It was resolved without drama, just a firm decision. I went home afterward and sat on my porch with my grandmother's old blanket, crying quietly because even when you win, you grieve the life you thought you'd have. Months passed, and the divorce finalized with a stack of papers and a tired exhale. I felt older, thinner somehow, but also steadier. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned Mark and the woman hadn't lasted. The fantasy burned out quickly once reality demanded generosity neither of them possessed. Later, I agreed to a dinner date, months removed from the chaos, mostly to prove to myself I wasn't broken. The man was kind and attentive, and for a while I felt almost normal. Then his phone buzzed, and he flipped it face down without thinking. My heart slammed like I'd been dropped from a height. I left abruptly, embarrassed by my own reaction, and cried in my car until my head ached. I texted him later with a brief explanation, expecting awkwardness. He replied with kindness and no pressure, and that gentleness undid me more than anger ever could. Not long after, I ran into the woman in a grocery store parking lot. She looked thinner, defensive, and launched into explanations about what Mark had told her about me. I listened without heat, realizing she needed a story where she wasn't responsible. When she accused me of always being jealous, I recognized the resentment she'd been carrying since childhood. I told her quietly that she could have built her own life instead of trying to take mine. For the first time, my anger felt finished. I got in my car and drove home with steady hands. Sitting in my living room later, I realized that while betrayal had changed me, it hadn't taken everything. The house was still mine. My life was still unfolding, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. In the weeks after that parking lot encounter, something subtle shifted inside me. The sharp edge of vigilance dulled just enough for me to notice the quiet again. Not the frightening quiet that follows loss, but a steadier one that comes from knowing no one is actively undermining your life. I still had moments where my body reacted before my thoughts caught up, where a sound or a phrase sent a ripple of tension through me, but they passed more quickly now. Therapy continued to be less about fixing and more about understanding. Learning how my nervous system had been rewired by betrayal and how to gently teach it that the danger had passed. I stopped apologizing for my reactions and started treating them like information instead of flaws. Work slowly regained its shape. I wasn't magically healed, but I was more present. I delegated instead of absorbing everything, took my breaks instead of skipping them out of guilt, and started leaving on time when I could. One afternoon, a nurse thanked me for backing her up with a difficult family, and I felt something warm spread through my chest, a reminder that I was still competent, still grounded in something real. I wasn't just a woman who had been betrayed. I was still Emily, someone who mattered in rooms that had nothing to do with my marriage. My mother adjusted too, though not without friction. She stopped pushing reconciliation with people who'd hurt me, even if I knew it cost her socially. One evening, as we sat on the porch drinking tea, she admitted she'd spent years prioritizing smooth surfaces over honest ones. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was close enough to feel meaningful. My father stayed quietly steady, never asking intrusive questions, never pushing me to feel a certain way. His support showed up in practical gestures, like fixing a loose step or bringing over extra groceries. Love translated into action. I learned through the same neighborhood grapevine that Mark had tried telling his version of the story more than once, painting himself as confused, pressured, wronged. Apparently, it didn't land the way he hoped. People are more perceptive than we give them credit for, especially when patterns repeat. I didn't correct the record or defend myself. Silence, I discovered, was not weakness. It was a boundary. Every time I chose not to engage, I felt a little more of my energy return. The house began to feel different too, not just quieter, but aligned. I fixed small things I'd put off for years, repainted the porch railing, planted herbs in the backyard because my grandmother used to love the smell of basil on her hands. Sometimes I sat at her old kitchen table and let myself remember her without the ache being overwhelming. She'd been a practical woman, one who believed in paperwork, independence, and not letting charm override common sense. I wished I could tell her she'd been right. In a way, I thought, maybe she already knew. Dating remained tentative. I didn't rush it, didn't force myself into situations that made my chest tighten just to prove something. When I did go out, I paid attention to how I felt instead of how I thought I should feel. I learned to name my triggers out loud when they came up, not as confessions, but as context. Some people drifted away, uncomfortable with that level of honesty. Others stayed, responding with patience instead of defensiveness. I noticed the difference and let it matter. One afternoon, months after everything had settled legally, I received a forwarded message from a mutual acquaintance. Mark had tried to joke about losing everything because of a misunderstanding, and someone had finally shut him down, telling him to stop blaming me for his choices. I stared at the message for a long time, then closed it without responding. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt finished. His narrative no longer required my participation. I still thought about the restaurant window sometimes. The version of myself sitting in her car creating a secret email account with shaking hands. I didn't like how scared she was, how methodical she became out of necessity, but I respected her. She did what she had to do to survive something that could have cost her far more than a marriage. Without her caution, her refusal to ignore what felt wrong, I might have lost my grandmother's house, my financial stability, my sense of self. She wasn't paranoid. She was paying attention. On quiet nights, when the house creaked and old habits tried to resurface, I practiced what I'd learned. I grounded myself. I touched the solid things around me, the table, the doorframe, the worn edge of the couch. I reminded myself where I was, who I was, and what was no longer true. The panic didn't disappear overnight, but it no longer ran the show. It became background noise instead of a command. I stopped thinking about forgiveness as something I owed anyone. Instead, I thought about integration, about allowing the story to exist without letting it define the rest of my life. I didn't excuse what happened. I didn't minimize it. I simply stopped carrying it everywhere I went. That felt like the closest thing to freedom I'd known in years. One evening, as I made tea in the kitchen, I realized I was humming without noticing. The sound startled me, not because it was loud, but because it was effortless. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was peace adjacent. A sign my body was no longer braced for impact. I carried my mug to the porch and watched the street the way my grandmother used to. Neighbors passing, life unfolding in small, ordinary ways. The world hadn't ended, it had narrowed, sharpened, and then slowly expanded again. I understood now that my life was never something anyone could steal, simply by wanting it more. Not a jealous woman, not a charming husband with rehearsed lies. What was mine remained mine because I chose to protect it. Even when doing so was uncomfortable, even when it meant being seen as difficult or cold. Strength, I learned, doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like documentation, boundaries, and the quiet decision to stop explaining yourself. As I finished my tea and went inside, I locked the door once, just once, and went to bed. The house settled around me, familiar and solid. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges, but they would be mine to meet, not something hidden in someone else's agenda. And that, finally, felt like a future worth stepping into.